So we are in the section that's called by some commentators the Sermon on Discipleship. We probably have more than one of these in the Gospels, even in Luke, but this is the one that seems to be the last great discourse that Jesus gives as his disciples are approaching Jerusalem. There's certainly a whole lot more material we're going to go through. The triumphal entry, as it's called, doesn't actually happen until chapter 19, so we still have quite a bit of material to cover, and Luke seems to present it to us with an eye toward having us think that all of these things are sort of happening in rapid succession as he's approaching the city of Jerusalem. I think every commentator grants that Luke is playing with the material. All of the gospel writers do that. They are all not only reporting something of Jesus' story, but they're certainly rearranging the chronology here and there to suit their own purposes. And that's fine. It's especially fine in the ancient discipline of historiography. You'll find that kind of thing going on. You'll see that, in other words, if you read Herodotus, you'll see him doing the same kind of thing. It's not that this is a uniquely biblical approach. We, in our Western tradition, tend to think a lot more chronologically. Everything's got to kind of follow right down the path as if it were being measured out on a calendar. And the ancient writers didn't really feel quite so bound to a chronological sequence. So they freely play with the order of stories in order to suit that purpose. But Luke wants us to at least feel the drama of Jesus now closing in on Jerusalem, because this is where the sparks are going to fly. This is where there's going to be this great confrontation that will certainly culminate in his own execution. But at the same time, Luke will show us that Jesus doesn't come out defeated. He comes out the victor in all of this, even though in that great drama we might wonder at certain points about it. And so much of the material here is intended to kind of set us up for that. This sermon on discipleship is in 3 parts. Every good sermon should have 3 parts, and this one does. And I've called the first part the perspective on heaven, or the view of heaven. That's where we learn that we should fear God and not man. We should be God-fearers. That's the great cure for hypocrisy. Many Christians, of course, are accused of being hypocritical. People say, I don't go to church, they're full of hypocrites. It's probably true, Okay, mea culpa. We are hypocritical. What's the cure for that? The cure is to be less interested in what people are thinking, more interested in what God is thinking. It's easy to say, hard to do, but Jesus, of course, drives that point home, and his poignant moment where that kind of fear of God will have its most dramatic expression is when we are on trial, when we are called to confess Christ before people. It's one thing to be a closet Christian, to kind of have little secrets in my heart. It's another thing to come out of the closet, say, I'm a Christian. Anybody who wants to know, ask me, I'm a Christian, confessing it. Jesus says, whoever confesses with his mouth Jesus is Lord, believes in his heart God raised him from the dead, that one will be saved. There is a public aspect to being a Christian, and that's what Paul is driving at, and that really is what we need to be thinking about when it comes to this matter of fearing God and not man, The second part of the sermon has to do with the view of this world, and especially possessions, that we should be detached from any preoccupation with the stuff of this world. Jesus is talking to people who soon enough are going to be called upon to liquidate their possessions. These are the same people who become the 120, who will in fact go and sell what they have and bring it to the apostles' feet for the benefit of that early growing Christian community there. And I was criticizing last week the tendency we have in our culture to be a little obsessed with it, and my wife later pointed out how hypocritical I am. So now it's time for confession. Because you may recall last week I was mentioning to you about, and I was saying this somewhat disparagingly, of course, with my wholly condescending attitude, about these game shows that would have people just going crazy when they rolled a sofa out on the stage, You recall that if you were here. And she was pointing out to me, of course, if I were at the game show and they were rolling out a brand new laptop computer, I'd be as bad as the other people because I'm kind of a technology, and so, okay, I confess. Point taken. But isn't it true? We, especially in our cultural setting, have been fed this bill of goods by Madison Avenue and by the whole media complex of our nation that unless you've got the latest trinket, the latest toy, you really can't be happy. I'm always impressed with our young people when they go down to Tijuana to build houses or go to a third world setting. I think it's true of any of us that have that experience, how you find that people can be in the most modest of circumstances and nevertheless be filled with joy. And it's like it hits us, how can this be? I've been hearing all my life that unless I've got this or that, I can't be happy. And here's people who don't have any of that stuff and they are happy, happier than I am. And it comes as a bit of a shock, doesn't it? And Jesus wants us to have some appreciation of that. We come now to the third and the most lengthy of the themes in this three-part sermon. And that begins in verse 35, which we just started last week. We'll pick up at verse 41. But this is the view of the future. So we have the view of heaven, the view of earth, and now the view of coming events. I was mentioning it's easy for us, of course, to read this and want to immediately leap to a view of this as kind of seeing it as the second coming of Christ. We live at a time right now when everybody is interested in the second coming. Even the History Channel is telling us, that the apocalypse is coming, that Armageddon is going to be in 2012 and so on. I mean, when has it ever been a time that people haven't been sort of caught up in that frenzy of wondering if we're living in the last days? Well, maybe we are. I don't claim to be any great guru on that point, but I think we need to be cautious with this text that we don't immediately leap to that kind of view of it. Jesus is clearly talking to his people at that time about events that would be taking place in their near future. And that, first of all, needs to be what's in our minds as we try to understand this text. Then we can step back and say, okay, now, with that in focus, how might I take these principles and apply them to my own life here living in the year 2000? What is it? 2009, right? Funny thing about old age, isn't it? It doesn't really much matter anymore. It's just, if you're in the right millennium, you figure you're close enough. So, anyway, let's pick up. Last week we saw this introductory paragraph, and really the theme, I think you'd probably agree with me, is watchfulness. The first thing Jesus wants these people to understand is they need to be on their tiptoes, as it were, with a sense of expectation. That era in which they lived, that world in which they moved and lived and had their being was going to reach its end, and it would be happening pretty soon. It's not necessarily the end of the world, but it was going to be the end of their world. This whole paradigm, centered in Jerusalem, centered in a system of worship that was organized around themes that had been in place for centuries, was all going to be dismantled. And in a sense, their normal view of how things operate was going to be thrown up in the air, and something brand new was going to come and take its place. And that really, in some ways, is what is sort of at the heart of this. So be watchful. Two images are used. One, that these people are like servants whose master has gone away for a while and is going to come back. And he wants to come back finding them having prepared the place for him. So you recall that. Went away to a wedding feast, several days, he's gone. And then he'll come back, and he may very well come back in the wee hours of the morning. You shouldn't be sleeping when he comes back. The house should be lit up. The gate should be ready to open immediately if he knocks at the gate. All of that is a sense of expectancy. And then the other image that Jesus uses in the same paragraph is the famous thief in the night. We don't know exactly when he's going to come back. They didn't know exactly when these things were going to be thrown into turmoil. It happened in a heartbeat, historically speaking. It happened so rapidly. So they needed to be thinking about it, anticipating when this great shift was going to occur. Now, the next paragraph, beginning at verse 41, really is taking up the question, what do you do as a practical matter to be watchful? What do you do as a practical matter to be expectant, what does that look like? Does it look like putting on a white sheet and going out on top of a mountain and waiting, Is that what it looks like? Some people think so. But Jesus seems to give different counsel here. This is a rough paragraph, so brace yourself. Fasten your seatbelts. Verse 41, Luke chapter 12, the Word of God. Peter said, Lord, do you say this parable to us or to everybody? The Lord said, who is the faithful and wise steward, whom the Lord appoints over his household to provide food at the right times? Blessed is that slave who, when the Lord returns, finds him doing that. Truly I say to you, he will place him over all his goods. But if that servant says in his heart, my Lord delays coming, and he begins to beat his male and female servants, eating and drinking and getting drunk, the Lord of that servant will return in a day that he does not expect and in an hour that he does not know, and will chop him into pieces and give him his portion with the unbelievers. The slave who knows the will of his master and does not prepare or do his will be beaten with many stripes. The one who didn't know and yet does things worthy of punishment will be beaten with few. Because to whom much is given, much is exacted. To whom much is entrusted, much is asked. It's kind of a depressing text, actually. But if you are depressed, I'm glad to tell you that Deandra Roberts is running a class right after this one on depression. So you can, just go right from here to there, and I can depress you, and you can go and then get uplifted there, and it'll all net out in the end. But anyway, it's a rough text. Let's ask God to give us insight into it. Heavenly Father, we are grateful that you speak to us with such clarity. We know that this is a message not only to your people there at that time in history, but certainly to us as well. We pray that we would have ears to hear, eyes to see, a heart disposed to embrace and learn and grow from these things, and that you would help us by your grace so to do. We give you thanks in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, well, we see here in this paragraph then two kinds of servants, don't we? We see the faithful servant, the unfaithful. Peter asked, Lord, are you speaking this parable to us or to everybody? We are very happy that Peter is always there to ask the question that everybody else was thinking but was afraid to ask, I heard someone say once Peter had wonderful foot-in-mouth disease. That was kind of it. And here, of course, we kind of almost detect what was in his mind. He had just heard Jesus say, if you look back to verse 37, blessed are those servants who, when the Lord comes, finds them watchful. Amen, I say to you, the master will roll up his sleeves and make them sit down and will feed them a nice feast. He will reward his servants for their faithfulness. Peter goes, note to self, I want to be in on that. And he didn't want to miss any point. So now when Jesus took a breath, Peter immediately pipes up and says, now wait a minute, Lord, I want to get something clear. This part about being specially treated, recognized, rewarded for our faithfulness, are you saying that to everybody, or is that just us apostles? That's kind of the spirit of the thing. Is it just us special people who are the insiders who are going to have this wonderful opportunity, or is this kind of a generalized axiom that you're throwing out there for everyone? Jesus doesn't answer the question directly. He answers it somewhat obliquely, but by the time we're done, we have a pretty good idea what the answer is. So here it goes. He says, the Lord said, okay, who is the wise and faithful steward, is the word, whom the Lord appoints over his household to provide food at the proper time? Which of the ones he appoints, in other words, is wise and faithful? That's the force of the question. Who is the truly wise? Who is the truly faithful servant that the Lord is going to appoint? Meaning, at least impliedly, he may appoint some people that are not wise and are not faithful and may not get this reward that I've intimated. The ones who will get it are the wise and the faithful ones. So that's kind of the force of the question. Who are the truly wise and faithful servants? The word there, translated servant or steward, it may be in your text, is the word oikonomos. Oikonomos. Oikos is the word house. Nomos is the word law. It literally means house law. It's the word from which we get the English word economy. So economy is taken straight from the Greek, transliterated. Adam Smith famously made that the discipline that he, of course, worked out, and he was quite conscious in alluding to the biblical idea. It means the house law. His notion was that God has instilled into this creation certain rules by which things work. And he was concerned especially about the rules of finance, money, wealth, etc., his wealth of nation, and so on. But it was a broader idea. And the original sense was taken from this notion that we have here. It could mean either the law of the house put in place by the master of the house. You know, if you own a house, you can set the rules. The garbage goes out on Tuesdays. We vacuum on Thursdays. I mean, that, you can make the rules. But it was also a word that was used to apply to the person responsible to do the thing, to keep the rules, or to have the obligation to make sure that they took place. He was called the house law, but the word we would probably use is the word steward, the responsible person to make sure that those laws are being carried out. The implication here is that God was going to create a community of faith, and in that community he was going to place people who would have specific duties, responsibilities to the people of God to do things that would carry out God's purposes for them, which Jesus sort of puts metaphorically as feeding them at the right time. That's, of course, a wonderful image in the Scriptures of providing for the needs that people have, to feed them, to care for them, and so on. This would happen in this early community that was going to be created in Jerusalem. These people, these 120 or so that Jesus is talking to, will be pressed into service. Remember, on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 people came into the church. Thousands more over the next several days and weeks and months. Don't you think that these 120 who had been with Christ, who had been sitting at his feet now for some time, are just almost by the nature of the case going to be forced into positions of leadership in that new community? Here's brand new Christians, and these are the folks that have some experience. They were with Jesus. They heard this, and these instructions from Christ are going to come back to them with great power, because they're all of a sudden going to be in that position. They're going to be feeding the flock. They're going to be providing, caring, watching out for, guiding, encouraging, counseling, and so on. All of these brand spanking new Christians, who come in. So that's the first thing he wants them to understand. Is those are the ones who are going to be the recipients of God's great acknowledgement. What about us? We have the same situation. Every one of us moves and lives in a community. We're here in a community in the church. We have a place where we work. We have maybe business or school or whatever it might be. We have places in which there are people looking to us to care for, provide, help, encourage, feed them. We all have that, little neighborhoods in which we operate. And so we need to think about it in those terms, that just as God is calling these people to act in that way, we are being, all of us, called, of course, to be asking, who is the person to whom God has called me to provide some kind of ministry? All right, so who is such an one? Whom the Lord, so verse 43 then, blessed is that slave, that servant, who when the Lord returns finds him doing that. In other words, the question kind of is, how do we prepare? How are we watchful? How are we expectant? And the answer is not by making ourselves irrelevant, detaching ourselves from earth's responsibilities, but in fact to be fully engaged. It's those who are doing that, who are providing food, who are caring in their community. Those are the ones who will be deemed faithful and wise stewards. We need to be busy. In other words, we need to be involved. I have this on my mind a little bit because, as you know, I teach a class out at Whitworth on cults. And it just amazes me how almost on a kind of predictable basis, the cults that have a sort of end-of-the-world mentality will invariably call their people away from involvement. They call them into little sort of communities where they're totally isolated, believing they're the only ones to be saved and waiting for grand destruction to come to the world. But they are the ones holed up in their little tiny enclave who are going to be the ones who actually have salvation. How different is Jesus' instruction, you see, where he doesn't send us away to tiny little cloistered communities, but sends us out, as it were, into the place where we can actually do service. Jesus is not sounding like some of the cult leaders that are out there trying to peddle their goods. And so this is the one. It's the one that's doing this that is going to be the recipient of this great reward. Truly I say to you, verse 44, that he will appoint him over all his goods. So that kind of verse 44, in a sense, answers the question that was left dangling in verse 37. Who are the ones for whom this great reward will be provided? It is those who have been responsible in dealing with the instruction that Jesus himself gave. Now, Jesus sets that in contrast to a different kind of servant in the community, and so the contrast here, verse 45, but if that slave says in his heart, my Lord delays in his coming, and he begins to beat, is the word, the male and female servants. Luke is always very balanced in his gender references. This is one example of many. His male and female servants eating and drinking and getting drunk. Now, that's halfway through the sentence, but let's pause there for a moment. Here's the other kind. Is it possible to be a leader in the church, but to abuse the privilege? Is it possible to exploit the people of God for your own gain? Is it possible, in a sense, to beat them up so that you can feather your own nest, as it were? Is it possible? Answer, yeah. This is, all through history, we have multiple examples of people abusing the authority they have in the church, using religion as a device for personal gain at the expense of those that they are supposed to be feeding. So Jesus is warning these who are this small group. They would be in a peculiar position where they could do just that. They could set themselves up kind of like little sort of demigods there in the community of faith and force people to listen to what they said as if they were the very voice of God on every decision. Little cult leaders, in other words, within the community of faith. And Jesus gives them warning against doing that. Of course, he's probably also thinking about what's happening right at that moment in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem at that time was under the supervision of corrupt usurpers, people who had taken control of the temple, turned it into a den of thieves, as Jesus himself would say, who are loading burdens on people's backs and not lifting a finger to help them, who are just realizing all kinds of revenue from their religious status, and yet at the same time burdening God's people, leaving them crushed under the weight of their kind of dictatorial and totalitarian religious schemes and so on. And Jesus has no time for that. He's going to be brutal in his condemnation of that. That's the status quo in the city of Jerusalem right now. Jesus is heading to Jerusalem to confront them. And we see that, don't we see that through the history of the church? Martin Luther in the year 1510 went to Rome This is before the Reformation. He's a monk there in a monastery in Germany. In the world of that day, Germany was like the rural regions. It was way out in the kind of unsophisticated, rude regions. And Martin Luther knew that. He was a German. They understood they were sort of like inferior to the great, people that lived in Rome. Rome was the center of everything. It was the city of the martyrs. It was the city of the saints. It was the city of the popes. It was the place where you were just 1 or 2 steps away from heaven itself. It was the most wonderful place on earth. And Luther, as a kind of humble German monk, was very excited about going to Rome and seeing the wonderful, marvelous display of God's work in this world. And if you know the story of Martin Luther, you know that when he got there, he was bitterly disappointed. It was a brutal, disillusioning experience because what he found in Rome among the people who were supposed to be the great leaders of the church was just slick professionalism, a kind of, hypocrisy and insincerity, wealth at the expense of the people of God. And I think probably Luther felt a lot as he experienced that, like what Jesus was going to anticipate when he got to Jerusalem. It's so easy. It's so easy to use religion as a means, a device for personal gain. And we've seen it again and again, and we need to be on our guard, even as, just individual Christians, that we don't find ourselves ever doing anything like that. That's what Christ is condemning here. So, if eating and drinking, getting drunk, he says, verse 46, the Lord of that slave will come in an hour that he does not expect, in a day that he does not expect, in an hour that he does not know, and chop him up. It's a very strong word. It's the same word that they used in those infomercials in the first century, like Vegematic, that kind of thing. It was that's the word that applies here. We'll put him in the food processor is sort of the modern idiom, we might say. This person is going to pay dearly for the abuses that they have been responsible for in their conduct here among the people of God. Jesus doesn't want to have any sense that there's some kind of special consideration to such a person just because they were such an elevated church person, as if that gave them some kind of special deal. And so he used a very strong word, and a somewhat violent word, honestly, to describe that. He's going to chop him up and give him his place with the unbelievers. This person who has been abusing his status among the people of God is going to be cast out and treated no better, and indeed in some ways worse, than those who were never believers in the first place. You see, it's supposed to cause all of us who are involved in any kind of ministry to be very, very thoughtful about what we do. Every one of you in this room is a leader in this church. People are looking to you, And we may think, well, I'm an awful long way from those scribes and Pharisees, those wicked people. But hey, let's not be too quick to let ourselves off the hook here. Jesus is saying this as a warning to them and as a warning to us that there is a kind of self-examination that we're supposed to engage in. James says, be not many teachers, knowing that teachers will receive the stricter judgment. Which makes me wonder, why am I teaching Sunday school class? And every pastor and every church leader and everybody on session and everybody who does anything in the church should be, kind of replaying that in your mind, that this is a risky business. We're called to do it, but at the same time, there's a great responsibility that rests on our shoulders as we do it. And so Jesus wants he doesn't want to mince words here at all. He says, then kind of in an axiomatic way, he says, that slave who knows the will of his Lord and does not prepare or do it will be beaten with many stripes. The one who does not know and yet does things culpable or things that are worthy of punishment will be beaten with few. It stands for a general idea that we run into here and there through the Scriptures, that there is a gradation of guilt. That there are many stripes, there are few stripes. Stripes are never good, So no stripes would be better. But it is possible to enter into judgment with a greater guilt or a lesser guilt, depending on how a person has discharged their duties. And that idea of a gradation of guilt, of course, translates into and has been classically taught in the history of the church as gradations of severity of anguish in hell. This sometimes comes as a bit of a shock to moderns who sometimes think that anybody that's in hell is just as bad as for anybody else. But the Bible doesn't really support that, it doesn't seem, and certainly the church in her main traditions has never supported that. So Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant classically have all taught that some people are definitely worse off in hell than others. Anybody in hell would prefer to be somewhere else. It's not like it's ever pleasant, but it can be much less pleasant for some than for others, depending on how responsibilities were discharged in this life. And it seems that there is the if I can put it this way, hottest place of all, the worst, most horrifying place of all, would be for someone that abused the truth of God, breached that great responsibility for their own gain at the expense or to the destruction of those who were placed under their charge. There is a huge kind of debt of guilt that tends to be associated with that. It should make us shudder every time we hear of anybody who's in some kind of pastoral ministry who it becomes clear that they've abused their religious authority for purely personal gain. It seems that there's some kind of special sort of sanction that attaches there. It reminds me of, some of you have read Dante's Inferno, and you know that as he tells in that graphic poem, his tour through hell describes seeing some of his least favorite popes, there in the worst places in hell. I think he probably had this text in mind. But be that as it may, you do have that idea, don't you? You have, just as Jesus says, lay up for yourselves rewards in heaven or treasures in heaven, implying that somehow what we do here will have an eternal consequence. The flip side also seems to be true. And so we have then, more or less as a biblical axiom, this last statement, the last part of verse 48. To whom much is given, much will be required. To whom much is entrusted, much will be asked. So Jesus is giving his followers here, this small band of people who are going to become the core of his church in Jerusalem within just the next few weeks, this weighty responsibility, this clear instruction that they need to be minding their P's and Q's as they find themselves in these relationships of authority and leadership. We, of course, need to always ask ourselves, who is looking at me? Who's watching my life? And my behavior, my words, my treatment of them is somehow influencing the health of their spirit, because every one of us has somebody watching us. Every one of us has somebody that is kind of gauging their own life somehow by what you're doing. And so, the warning is as much for us as for them, even though the immediate setting was for them. Well, lest we miss the general point, Jesus presses right on, and notice the next text just kind of turns up the heat even more. So he's just told them about chopping them up and giving their place with the unbelievers, and there may have been a little look of shock on the faces of some of these folks who have been following Jesus now. And so just to make sure they didn't miss the point, he goes ahead and says in verse 49, I came to cast fire upon the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism with which I must be baptized, and how I wish that were already over. You think that I came to give peace to the earth. No, I say to you, rather division. From here on, it's going to be that there will be 5 in a house, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. A father divided against his son, a son against his father, a mother against her daughter, a daughter against her mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. I have come to cast fire on the earth. The Greek word there is the word balein. It's from the Greek verb balo, from which we get the word ball, which is an object that is thrown. And that's what the Greek word means, to throw. And it's a word that could only be construed as a judgment text. I have come to throw, to cast fire on the earth. That's why I'm here, you see. You think I'm gentle Jesus, meek and mild? Think again, Why am I here? I will go as a lamb silent to the slaughter, to be sure, but don't think that's the end of the story. Don't think that there will not be, as Revelation says in chapter 6, the wrath of the Lamb. We don't usually think of lambs as wrathful, do we? But this lamb not only has redemption, this lamb has wrath. And Jesus wants us to hear that. So I've come to cast fire. And now the word can be translated earth, but it's the word gay, which means also, like the word we have the word geo from that in English, it means on the land. The land. I've come to cast fire on the land. That there will be a fiery judgment. John the Baptist said it. Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? His fan is in his hand. This is about to happen. There's going to be this wrath. Jesus himself reiterates the message that there is a judgment coming. And there was a judgment coming at that time, and it was going to come with great drama. Many commentators believe Jesus here is self-consciously incorporating, or at least alluding to, the last chapter of the Old Testament. Malachi chapter 4, where that last prophet of the Old Testament predicts that the messenger of the covenant is going to come, and he is going to come with a fiery judgment, you see. By the way, this is the same messenger of the covenant who's also said in Malachi to be the one who would come, and that people were looking forward to it. But then Malachi asks in chapter 3, who can abide the day of his coming? Which are great words from the Messiah. Remember that? John Frankhauser stands up. I love it when he sings that piece, and he talks about who can, I wish I could really do it, who can withstand the day of his coming? He will be like the fuller's fire, and he will shake. I could do that. Isn't that great? It's just great. And John does it so well, you just feel the place shaking. But that's not just poetry, friends. That's Malachi predicting a day was coming when this messenger of the covenant would show up. Everyone thought, oh, great, it's the messenger of the covenant. What a wonderful thing. Who can abide that day? This is going to be a day of fire. It's going to be a day of judgment. And Jesus says, I've come to cast fire on the earth. This is supposed to warn us, warn them. You better make sure you're on the right side. Because this man who comes as a redeemer is also coming as a judge. And the judgment would befall that city within that generation. It was only a few years in the future. And so, he's giving that. Already I wish it were kindled. But verse 50, but I have a baptism with which I must be baptized. And the implication is, before he can cast fire on the earth, he has to go through his own baptism of fire. Because Jesus, who will both be the judge of that city, is also going to be the redeemer and will absorb, in a sense, God's fire with respect to those who are redeemed. And then he says of that, being very human at this point, how I wish that were already over. Looking forward to the cross, looking forward to the atonement, looking forward to the hell that he would experience, standing in the target area of God's wrath for the sins of those for whom he died. And how he wished that were already over. Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. He wails in Gethsemane. But that baptism couldn't be avoided. If he's going to be the Redeemer, there'd be that baptism. But at the same time, there's going to be the judgment that would come just scant few, 2 or 3, 4 decades later. So he goes on. You think, he's looking at their faces, that I came to bring peace to the land. No, not peace, division. Jesus, of course, is announced at his birth as the Prince of Peace. And it's right for us to think of him in those terms. But he's not the Prince of Peace to everybody. He's the Prince of Peace for those who embrace him and find, number one, and first and foremost, peace in their own souls, peace like a river, peace that transcends understanding, the peace that comes by a conscience unburdened. That's profound peace. And when I meet you and you meet me and we find out that we together share in that peace, it gives us a peace between us that is wonderfully deep, inexpressibly profound unity among God's people as we share in this wonderful peace that God gives. But for those who stand on the other side of the gap and say, Christ is my enemy, and if Christ is my enemy, anyone that represents him is my enemy, there's no peace, There is a kind of peace, I guess you'd say, that this world has, and it's humanism. A peace that takes its stand against the Lord and against his anointed. Let's cast off their bands. Let's throw away their shackles. There's a kind of peace people can have in their solidarity to fight God's purpose, God's law, God's people. There's a kind of peace they can have, a this worldly, secular, evil peace, rooted in Satan himself. There's a peace there, but certainly no peace with Christ. And Jesus says, I've come to bring a division, to divide the house. Come to bring a sword. From now on, it's going to be, there'll be 5 in a house, 3 against 2. The reason Jesus puts it this way is just to make sure we understand this is not simply a division among nations, a division among ethnicities, a division among socioeconomic classes, or any such thing. It's a division that can run right down the middle of the most intimate human relationships, so that a father can be divided against his son over Christ, a mother against her daughter, that the most close and wonderfully affectionate relationships can be divided over the effect that Christ has when he enters the picture. I think many of you, from personal experience, know something of that and know the truth of it. Going on from there, he then says to the crowd, all of this has been addressed to this smaller group, but it's as if the larger group is there, kind of listening in, overhearing, and now he addresses himself to them. And he says, you folks, when you see a cloud rising out of the west, immediately you say, it's going to rain. And it does. And when you feel a little south wind blowing, you say, it's going to be hot. And it is. You bunch of phonies. You're so good at reading the face of the earth and of the sky, and yet this time, you just can't figure it out. It's like being so precise in catching these little subtleties of a day and that which is screaming at you as the real significance of this moment in history. You just miss it. How can you do that? In that region, the Mediterranean was to their west. You know that weather tends to move from west to east. We tend to get Seattle's leftover weather, And that was the same there, only their weather came from the west, which was the Mediterranean. So when they saw a cloud rising, they knew it was rising off the Mediterranean, and that probably within a day or so, that cloud with rain would be dropping its precipitation on them. And they could discern that. They could see that very subtle, acute meteorological insight. They'd feel a little south wind blowing. The winds tended to blow up from Egypt. If they became severe, it was called the Scirocco, and it could actually blister the land. So when they felt a little south wind, they knew, this could be the beginning of something more fierce. They knew it's going to be hot. They were very acute. It was an agrarian society, and they were very good at observing the little subtleties of the weather and predicting what's going to happen based on tiny little sort of cues and signals that they might pick up. And now, Jesus says, as it were, nevertheless, here's this thing just blaring at you in the face. You've got John the Baptist who came preaching a judgment that's about to fall. You've got Jesus of Nazareth here, who's performing miracles that irrefutably prove that God is with him, predicting this great judgment that's about to fall. The Scirocco's nothing compared to what's coming. How come you're so focused on this and you miss that, you see? How is it that you can miss the sign of the time, as it were, the great gathering clouds of judgment that are growing? That's been true through history, Some people would say it's true of us. I don't know. Are we watching? Are we watching the times? Are we watching? We're always supposed to be thinking about that, not morbidly, but aware, tuned in. What's really happening in our world? What was really happening in their world? Jesus wants to make sure that we're not just hypocritically ignoring what is screaming in our face as the real significance of what's happening in any given moment, and especially for them. So he says, then we'll wrap this up. Let's take the last little paragraph. He says, this next phrase is hard to translate from Greek. It roughly means something like this. Why don't you exercise decent judgment with respect to yourselves, is one way to render it. It's kind of a rhetorical question which leads into this little short paragraph. As you are going with your adversary to the court, while you are in the way, you should make every effort to reconcile with him, lest perchance he hale you in before the judge hands you over to the prison guard bale, throws you into the prison. I'm telling you, you won't get out of there until you've paid the last farthing, the last pretty penny, And he's not saying this to them now in this context as if he's telling them something they don't know. When Matthew reports this little story, he puts it in the Sermon on the Mount. And there, he's focusing on horizontal relationships. Jesus is really appealing to this more as something that they already know, to ask them the question, if you're so good at understanding that you should settle with your adversary before you wind up in court, how come you're not settling with your major adversary, namely the God who's about to pour judgment on you? Now, if you don't mind me just putting on my lawyer hat for a minute here, I can't help it because the text invites it, but going to court is not what you ever want to do, okay? Sometimes I'd have clients, I think the lawyers in the room would agree with me on this. I would have clients that would come to me and they'd say so meekly, all I want is my day in court. And I say, you are an idiot, Let me tell you, the last thing you want is a day in court. Because even if you go to court and win, you will walk away from that experience having the same sensation that at least approximates the feeling of just having been raped. You will have the worst day of your life, regardless of outcomes. That is not a place where you just feel happy, sweetness, and light flooding in, vindicating your cause at the expense. It doesn't happen that way. Doesn't happen that way. The smartest thing any person can do is to figure out some way to reconcile with your enemy while you're on your way to the courthouse. That's the smart money right there. Sometimes people won't reconcile. Sometimes court is unavoidable. We can thank God it's there. I just don't want anyone to ever labor under the delusion that it's a pleasant experience. It's a horrible experience. The lawyers like it, to be honest. I kind of liked going to court personally, but the clients invariably found it, very, very unpleasant. So a little word of warning there. And Jesus is appealing to that. They knew that. The Talmud taught that. This was nothing new. This wasn't some kind of, great insight here. It's always better to settle than to find yourself before the judge whose decision can, alter your life for the worse permanently. Much better to come to terms outside of that courthouse setting. Jesus says, if you're so good at knowing that in human relationships, how come you don't figure out that the biggest plaintiff against you in the universe is about to pour out his wrath. Why don't you settle with that adversary before you get to the courthouse? Because that courthouse, you think a human courthouse is bad, wait till you get to that one, is the force of the warning there. And so this whole text, this was, of course, addressed to the world, but you can feel the force of it. The whole thing is to say to us in a rather stern way, life is about some, big things, for them especially, as they were heading into these early days of the church in Jerusalem, but all of us, of course, can take great help from this as well. And